For those of you who thought this would only happen once, some of you hoped for this, I am pleased to inform you that you were wrong, and maybe a little less pleased to inform John that he's stuck with us for a few more miles. This year, in case you're not aware, we are not in Washington, D.C. We have decided to flee the winter back east for the sunshine of the California shores. And while our friends up north have undergone a season of testing with the spreading flames, today we are pressing ahead in more fortuitous settings. Our prayers go out to them for the restoration of communities and the implementation of safeguards to avoid the repeating of history. The Witte lectures, as I have referred to them colloquially, have a very simple aim: to advance the conversation about the integration of Christianity and law, not only reflecting on the pioneers of old who have laid the foundation of the symbiotic dance between faith and law, but also to celebrate those presently advancing this field to those who will soon step into this important intellectual harvest. Last year, John was our keynote, and he focused on the future of Christianity and law and his reflections on the jurisprudential changes within the United States Supreme Court for the last 2 decades. This year, we venture outward to ask the question, what hath Christ to do with human rights? As part of this conversation, you have a program guide that takes as inspiration a combination of 3 art movements that fall within a pivotal time in the history of America. These 3 movements, American Impressionism, Tonalism, and Realism, find themselves between the great era of American landscape painters within the Hudson River School and the coming decline, in my opinion, of the artistic imagination with the rise of Dadaism that sought to confound the traditional models of creative output through shock, confusion, and frankly, in my opinion, nonsense. These 2 bookend movements can be seen as the shift from natural man to mechanical man, embodied from the works of Thomas Cole to the infamous nude descending a staircase of Marcel Duchamp. And since our focus today will be on the canvas of human rights, I thought it fitting that we build a program inspired by the paintings that find themselves between the man of nature and the man in struggle to control his human nature. That's the art. That's the inspiration there. And now the book that inspired this lecture, written by John himself, of course, published in 2022, entitled The Blessings of Liberty, Human Rights, and Religious Freedom in the Western Legal Tradition. I won't go on for too long, but I'd like to read a passage from the book and then allow the man himself to say a few words about his own creation. To say that human rights are useful and important is not to say that rights constitute a freestanding system of morality, or to render Christian moral and religious teachings superfluous. Some contemporary scholars do describe human rights as the new religion and catechism of modern liberalism, invented in the Enlightenment to place worn-out Christian establishments. Indeed, core human rights can take on near sacred qualities in modern societies. Moreover, ideals like liberty, equality, and fraternity, or life, liberty, and property, or due process and equal protection of the law often function as powerful normative totems. Modern human rights norms are better understood, however, John writes, as the jus gentium of our times, the common law of nations, which a variety of Jewish, Greek, Roman, patristic, Catholic, Protestant, and Enlightenment movements have historically nurtured in the West, and which today still needs the constant nurture of multiple communities in the West and beyond. To be sure, many formulations of human rights today are suffused with the fundamental beliefs and values of modern liberalism, some of which run counter to the cardinal beliefs of various religious traditions, including Christianity. But secular political philosophy does not and should not have a monopoly on the nurture of human rights. Indeed, a human rights regime cannot long survive under the executive patronage of secular philosophy. For human rights are middle axioms of political discourse. They are a means to the ends of justice and the common good. But the norms that rights instantiate depend upon the visions and values of human communities for their content and coherence, or what the Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain described as the scale of values governing their exercise in concrete manifestations. John, would you please grace us with your presence on stage and give a little bit on why you wrote this book and where this book is going for your own legacy?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sorkin, for your very kind remarks. Good evening to each of you. It's a great privilege to be standing here at a lectern that bears the name of my wife's husband, and to have a chance to celebrate with all of you in the company of distinguished judges and commissioners whom we'll hear from this evening. I want to say a very gracious and deep word of thanks to Anton Sorkin for his great kindness in creating this lectureship and mustering the support from a variety of different quarters. A special word of thanks to President Nemo at the Christian Legal Society and Dean Halvorson of the Trinity Law School, who so generously supported the creation of this event, the lectureship altogether, and bringing us together in this wonderful setting. The topic this evening on Christianity and human rights is both very timely and in some quarters very controversial. Our distinguished speaker this evening, based on long experience, will tell us why Christianity and human rights as a topic is deeply timely today. I want to talk a bit about why Christianity and human rights is controversial in some circles, and Anton already indicated some of that in the last quotation. And I want to also trouble the idea that it is controversial and suggest that it's a much more productive relationship than both Christians and human rights advocates tend to indicate today. Our liberal friends in the elite media and the elite academy tend to view Christianity as an enemy of human rights. Their argument is that human rights are the keys that unlock the shackles that Christianity had long imposed on Western civilization and released us from the bondage of Christianity. The inquisitions and pogroms and crusades and the violence and warfare that Christianity fomented, the establishment of a Christian faith that ultimately divided society between the true believers and the heretics, and committed all manner of hardship against those heretics. That argument has continued today, where Christianity is viewed as an impediment to the gradual expansion of human rights and the inclusion of new parties, sexual and racial minorities, immigrants, and others that need to be protected. It is easy to pick up any newspaper, any law review article, and to see that Christianity is viewed as the enemy, as the impediment to human rights. And in turn, in a number of Christian circles, human rights are thought to be the enemy of Christianity. Human rights are, the argument goes, a product of Enlightenment liberalism, where new secular ideas begin to emerge in place of Christian ideas that had dominated the West hitherto. Ideas that now privilege rights over duties, greed over charity, the individual over community, the pretended sovereignty of humanity over the absolute sovereignty of God. And the thought among many conservative Christians today is that human rights, especially in their pernicious forms and expansion today, really are something to be resisted by people of faith, including the Christian faith, and that we should turn to more traditional virtues and values of faith, hope, and love to build a good society and to build the foundations for constitutional order. I dare say that both of those narratives are misplaced. And even though they're often repeated, I think they forget the fact that Christianity produced many of the foundations for and the institutions of human rights that we take for granted today. And that Christians start with the Bible as the foundation for a number of the basic principles that human rights captures in its modern constitutional and international formulations. It begins with the admonition repeatedly in the New Testament that we are called to liberty. Christ has given us liberty. You enjoy the glorious liberty of the children of God, and we hear that repeatedly in the Bible. The Bible also, against the muscular patriarchy of its day, lifts up this radical ideal of equality. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, you are all one in Christ Jesus. And on the strength of those two basic organic texts, we have some of the first ingredients of a liberty and equality rights calculus. The Ten Commandments given to us in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy 5, yes, stipulate a set of duties that we owe to God and a set of duties that we owe to our neighbor, but very early in the development of the Western tradition, those duties get converted into rights. The first stable duties of honoring God and honoring God's name and honoring the Sabbath day are the foundation from the 3rd century forward for a repeated claim for the right to religious freedom, the right to worship God, the right to organize oneself in community, the right to be exempt from misusing God's name through improper oath swearing. The second table duties that we owe to our neighbor: don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, honor your father and mother, don't covet your neighbor's household. Those ideas become the foundation very early on in the Western tradition for basic rights to life and to property and to integrity and to the sanctity of the household and of the parent-child relationship and the privacy of the home. Those Old Testament admonitions we have repeatedly to take care of the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, are the foundation for basic understandings of the rights of those disadvantageous members of society. And Christ repeats our responsibilities to them by saying, as much as you do to the least of them, you do to me. The Old Testament and the New Testament are filled with concern about the indebted, the imprisoned, the indentured, and provide mechanisms whereby their plight can be relieved, if not ultimately liberated altogether. The New Testament talks about us being called to be prophets, priests, and kings, and on the strength of that, we find both the right and the duty as prophets to speak, as priests to serve and to pastor, and as kings to be part of rule in society. And one can go through the scripture and find all these organic tropes that provide the starting point in the Western tradition for the development of what we now call human rights today. Jura Hamana, as they were called from the 3rd century forward. And if you work initially through the Christianized church fathers and then through the medieval Catholics and then the Protestant reformers, especially the medieval and the Protestant moralists and philosophers and jurists and theologians, created a rich and ever-expanding latticework of public, private, penal, and procedural rights that are now the foundation of how we think about rights today. And it is no small anecdote that by 1650, every right that appears 150 years ago in the U.S. Bill of Rights and in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, by 1650, Catholics and Protestants alike had defined, defended, and died for each of those rights. And so the idea that Christianity and human rights are antithetical, that they are inimical, that they should be divided, in many ways is self-defeating. Christianity is one of the powerful foundations of human rights. And yes, much has been built on that foundation that gives folk pause today. Some of that foundation is cracking and creaking and needs to be reformed. But we as people of faith, we as people of Christian faith, have a role and responsibility to look at these children that we have been able to produce and call those back home that have been prodigalized and to be part of the reform process whereby those rights can be vindicated for all. It is not the only system whereby we love our neighbor, but it's a critical system whereby we love our neighbor, and we would do well to stick with it. That's all I have to say. Last year, I could talk for an hour. Anton said you have 5 minutes, and I probably have already breached. But I have the privilege of asking the Honorable Jamie Grosshans to come forward, distinguished jurist on the Florida Supreme Court, who will be both our hostess and conversation this evening and will introduce our wonderful speaker. Thank you so much.
Good evening. It's wonderful to see you all here on behalf of myself and my husband, Josh. It is a pleasure to be in Southern California. We are from Florida, where we had not seen the sun for 5 days, and we were suffering a lot. So it's good to be here in your beautiful state, and for me to be able to introduce you all to one of my favorite people in the world, Kristina Arriaga. You will read about her amazing accomplishments in this beautiful guide that you have been given tonight, including a really lovely introduction to Kristina from Professor Barkley at Georgetown, who is one of her dear friends and an incredible champion of religious liberty and religious freedom herself. And so I could discuss her 22 years at Beckett, where she was the executive director, and really oversaw that organization as it led its way through some of the biggest cases that you would recognize, including the Hobby Lobby, the Little Sisters of the Poor. As a side note, Hobby Lobby, the day that case came out and I watched that was the day I decided I wanted to become a judge. And so that is a very important case for me. I stood about 3 feet from the television waiting for that decision like I was watching the Super Bowl. And I thought if I cared that much, I should probably put my hat in that ring as well. But not only has she done that, but she also was appointed to be on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, where she was one of 9 commissioners, I believe, who traveled the world advocating for religious liberty, for human rights. She now serves on the Meta Oversight Board. And so these are all the amazing accomplishments that you can read about, and that you all know that she is truly experienced and we'll have a lot of interesting things to tell you tonight. But I thought I would tell you one of the things that I love about Kristina, which is a little more personal, and why I think that she is so perfect to speak as someone on inherent dignity of a human. And that is because Kristina sees every single person that she encounters as an individual created by God, who is there for a purpose, and who she is supposed to encounter at that given moment. And that could mean a dissident in Cuba. It could mean an American pastor in prison in Turkey. It could mean a group of law students who intern at the Florida Supreme Court that someone convinces her to come speak to. It could mean, a group of nuns who become an Instagram sensation because Kristina decides that the tagline needs to be "Help a sister out." Or it could be a girl who just graduated from college, who's crying in a bathroom in Oxford, and Kristina stays in that bathroom to give her a hug. Total stranger, but she saw her. And isn't that what you want the person who's talking to you about the inherent dignity of human life to be? Someone who sees people for who they are and who understands that each person is created in the image of God, and it is an act of worship of our Creator to treat those people with dignity, each one made in the image of God. So that's one of the many reasons I love Kristina, and why I think she is the perfect person to come and speak with us tonight about her experiences and observations as a champion of religious liberty across the world. So please join me in welcoming Kristina Arriaga.
I've had a live microphone on for the last 20 minutes. I consider that I should get danger pay for that. And we Cubans like to talk to ourselves too. It didn't happen. So thank you, Justice Grosshans, and thank you so much. That was a very, very generous introduction. I'll tell some stories about you when we sit down. So, all good. So next year, we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. There will be great festivities across this great country of ours, and communities will remember and be reminded of the foundational principles that made the Declaration and this country exceptional. Today, we're privileged to be in this room with John Witte, whose life's work ensured that people worldwide understand the role of religious freedom in the crafting of the Declaration. I have to agree with Nicholas Wolterstorff when he says we should be much poorer in our knowledge of the history of human rights. We would be much poorer in our knowledge of the history of human rights and religious freedom, and in our grasp of their importance, had John Witte not devoted his prodigious skills and energy to exploring the legal history of rights and freedoms in the West. John, your contributions to this enduring legacy are nothing but extraordinary. Thank you. It is a profound honor to be here participating in this remarkable series of conferences. Thank you to the Christian Legal Society, Trinity Law School, Anton, Sorkin, and of course, my good friends, the Grosshans, for your gracious invitation. Is everyone hearing me okay? Okay, good. We tend to be loud, the Cubans, so I wanted to make sure I wasn't yelling into the microphone. And you all seem like a very nice bunch that wouldn't tell me while it was happening, so thank you. So as we get closer to our 250th anniversary, all sorts of preparations will occur nationwide. The National Park Service is sprucing our monuments. The White House is getting cleaned. The Lincoln Memorial is also getting cleaned. There's a new museum that is getting put there. And all local communities by legislature have to have local programs. So what all of this is going on, we Cuban Americans are figuring out how to tell you that American freedom is thanks to us. So, maybe I exaggerate a little bit, but my people, the Cuban people, are one that we like to take credit. Ask any Cuban you know. Does anyone here have a Cuban friend? Yes, okay, so I'm telling the truth. So ask any Cuban and they will tell you Cuban provenance of anyone you name or some feat that somehow involved a Cuban. So for instance, Sammy Davis Jr., his father was Cuban. Did you know that? No? Yeah? Gloria Estefan, that's pretty obvious. 4 of the robbers are Watergate. Yes, born in Cuba. Not a paradigm of ethics, perhaps, but you cannot deny those Cuban guys were pretty brave. We're proud of that. First airplane hijacking, you guessed it, a Cuban, yeah. So I'm about to tell you another story about Cubans that you may not know about, but you will hear it for sure this year. In 1781, George Washington's Continental Army was running out of money. So Washington sent Admiral de Grasse to the Caribbean to get much needed funds. And de Grasse came back from all these countries empty-handed, except when he went to, exactly, you're getting it. Yeah, I'm so good at this already, teaching everyone so much about Cuba. So he went to Cuba, and there, word went out that the valiant and perhaps handsome French and Americans were battling the English and fighting for freedom. Hearing the pleas from de Grasse, the ladies of Havana, who not only loved freedom but hated the English who had occupied Cuba for many years, took a collection and they donated their jewelry to the cause of freedom. The collection totaled over 1 million pounds of silver. Their gift to Washington came with a letter that read, "So the Americans' mothers' sons are not born as slaves." So the American mother's sons are not born as slaves. Throughout the years, some historians, even in communist Cuba, have argued that this became the foundation of American democracy. So, is this story true? Did this really happen? Every legend carries a share of both fact and fiction, and the story of the ladies of Havana is no exception. While the tale of these women donating the jewelry to support Washington's army has been widely embraced, historical records reveal a more nuanced perspective. Specifically, nuance, Who wants nuance when you have a good story? Specifically, documents from the period suggest that right before the Battle of Yorktown, funds indeed came from Havana. But the source was likely a group of Spanish colonists in Cuba. Nonetheless, one thing remains undeniably true. Before Cuba became synonymous with oppression, Cuba was both a witness and a participant in shaping modern human rights theory. So, as the note from the ladies of Havana read, so no one will be born as slaves. I'd like to speak about two significant events separated by more than 4 centuries that profoundly influenced the development of rights as we understand them today. These events highlight the enduring connections between the modern concept of human rights and Christianity. One event occurred in the 16th century during Bartolomé de las Casas' famous debates regarding the rights of the indigenous people. These discussions laid an important part of a theological foundation that would resonate centuries later, particularly in 1948, when the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights marked a pivotal moment in human rights history, and where the Cuban delegate, largely forgotten by history, played a critical role in imbuing the Declaration with fundamental Christian principles. So, let's start with Bartolomé de las Casas. Who's familiar with him here? Okay, good. A good number of people. Scholars argue that the modern idea of human rights was gestating for a millennia. Imagine the poor mother. Okay. I'm going to say it again. So the world was pregnant for over a millennia. Okay, now you get it. I should have spoken a little bit slower. So scholar Paulo Carrozza argues that the actual birth, however, resulted in large part from disputes that emerged in the 16th century between authorities in Spain and a Spanish Dominican monk, Bartolomé de las Casas. He was 18 years old when in 1502 he went to the Indies. He went back to Spain, got ordained by a priest, and was sent back to Cuba to be the chaplain for the Spanish colonies. While in Cuba, Bartolomé de las Casas, like many other Spanish colonists, had what was called at the time an encomienda, where the natives were forced, under pretty horrible conditions, to work for the Spaniard in charge. He, even as a priest, he even went to confession to a Dominican priest who denied him absolution because he owned slaves. But he was unconvinced. However, something happened in 1514. We're not sure exactly what happened, where he had a profound conversion. He freed his slaves, and he became an ardent supporter of rights for the indigenous people. In 1550, Bartolomé, went to Mexico, and he refused to give absolution to any Spanish colonists that owned slaves. So as you can imagine, the Spanish kingdom was not too happy about this because a lot of their income came from slaves. So he was accused of treason, and he was flown to Spain in 1550 that year, and he was to engage in a number of debates defending his views. He was to appear before a panel of jurists and theologians to hear arguments made by his adversary, Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda. What followed were debates that essentially changed the world. Las Casas drew from law, philosophy, theology, and his own experience in the New World to argue for equality, for respect for the conscience of the natives, and he argued against coercing the slaves to convert. The scholarly research surrounding this topic is both extensive and insightful. deserving of thorough exploration. However, for the purposes of this discussion, I will narrow the focus to two of Las Casas' central contributions, which underscore his enduring legacy for modern rights jurisprudence. First, his methodological approach to argue in favor of human rights for the indigenous population was revolutionary at the time. Still is today. He utilized every intellectual and practical tool available to him, integrating aspects of Thomistic theology, philosophy, legal framework, and his personal experience to advocate for the rights and dignities of the indigenous people. This strategy not only bolstered his arguments, but also set a precedent in the way that we argue and talk about human rights. Second, at the heart of Las Casas' advocacy was an unwavering Christian truth. He argued with conviction that indigenous people are our brothers. Christ died for them too. His declaration placed the spiritual equality of the indigenous people beyond dispute, challenging the colonial powers to confront the moral contradictions of their actions. This core belief served as the bedrock of his campaign for justice, resonating across centuries as a profound testament to the universality of human dignity. Through these contributions, Las Casas not only shaped the discourse of his time, but laid a foundation for modern human rights principles. His idea, rooted in a deep commitment to human dignity, based unequivocally and unapologetically in Christianity, resonate across centuries and find a striking parallel in the development of one of the most significant human rights documents of the modern era, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As you know, modern discourse of human rights rarely takes place without invoking the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document has been hailed as the cornerstone of all human rights law. Since its adoption in 1948, the UDHR has influenced the creation of over 80 international human rights treaties and declarations, numerous regional conventions, domestic legislative frameworks, and constitutional measures, collectively forming a robust legal framework to advance and protect human rights. Just as important, I would argue, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has become a cultural phenomenon, invoked in school systems worldwide as early as kindergarten. Legally and culturally, the Declaration plays a vital role in the protection of rights. Or, in the words of Notre Dame scholar and my friend Paolo Carrozza, the Declaration is the most recognizable and influential reference point for cross-cultural communication about humanity's longing for justice and freedom, universal in more than just name. So it's a pretty important question whether the Declaration benefits or has drawn from Christianity, isn't it? Yet the Declaration, as John Witte was talking about earlier, is often presented solely in secular terms, sanitized from the profound religious roots that inform its creation, as if these religious roots are somehow incompatible with the document's moral authority, and in fact exert a tainting and polluting effect on the Declaration in particular and human rights in general. This perspective neglects significant aspects of the history of the Declaration, particularly the theological underpinnings and currents that shaped its drafting. Fundamentally, the making of the Declaration is the story of a group of men and women who brought to the drafting table deeply held convictions about the essence of humanity, about the origin of our rights and our individual and collective responsibility. For many delegates, these convictions were inseparable from their faith. The drafting process brought together philosophers and diplomats from various traditions, including Muslims, Hindus, Jews, and Christians, reflecting the rich tapestry of beliefs that inform the Declaration's universal ethos. A fundamental question confronted the delegates at the very outset of their work, a question that demanded reflection, consensus, and clarity. That question is, what makes us human? At its core, this inquiry was not merely philosophical or abstract, but profoundly moral. It required an articulation of humanity's essence that could transcend cultural and ideological divides, while speaking to the shared dignity inherent in every individual. Imagine that group of people. It was 1948. The world had been torn apart by World War II. There was no food in many parts of the world. Complete cities have been obliterated. Millions have been murdered in the Holocaust. There was a great push at the United Nations for much needed economic support. And yet this group of delegates met to talk about human dignity. The answer that ultimately prevailed, one could persuasively argue, was deeply rooted in a Christian understanding of the nature of man. This view, as John Witte referred to earlier, drawn from centuries of theological reflection, sees humanity as created imago Dei, in the image of God. It emphasizes that every person possesses an inherent worth, not because of their status, achievements, or abilities, but because they're children of God endowed with reason, free will, and the capacity to love. The Christian ethos permeated the deliberations, shaping a vision of human rights grounded in the belief that all individuals are equal before their Creator. He reminded the delegates that human dignity is not a product of human laws or institutions, but a divine gift, entrusted to humanity as both a privilege and a responsibility. This understanding compelled the affirmation that human rights are universal, inalienable, and rooted in a moral order that transcends time and circumstance. There is much literature on this topic, but I won't be the first nor the last to argue that it was Charles Malik, a devout Greek Orthodox Lebanese Arab Christian with a rich intellectual background in existentialist philosophy, who shaped this specific discussion. Charles Malik was a Lebanese diplomat who had studied under Heidegger for some time and under Whitehead at Harvard and wanted to be an academic. And instead, he was tasked to go and help write the preamble of the Declaration. To Malik, the Declaration transcended its role as a legal instrument. It embodied the potential to enable every individual to grow and to transform. Some of you who have studied Heidegger might recognize the idea of being and becoming in Malik's articulation of what it means to be human. I see someone nodding. That's good. Although he was working in a charged environment, Malik successfully convinced his fellow committee members that any discussion of human rights necessitated a comprehensive and dynamic understanding of human dignity. We take that for granted now. It's difficult to separate the concept of human rights from the exploration of what it means to be human and to possess intrinsic and unchangeable dignity. But this was not necessarily the idea that was accepted by the drafters initially. Many scholars argue that this conceptual leap between being human and having human dignity was championed by Malik. Although Malik avoided religious vocabulary during the drafting of the Declaration, he was very persuasive in his approach. Here's Malik. What is at stake here is man, its nature, his origin, his destiny, his understanding of himself. Is he a machine? Is he an animal with blind natural impulses and nothing more? Is he a mere cog in the will of the state? Is he a mechanical product of his social conditions? Or is he created by God after his own likeness and image, and therefore endowed with reason, with inherent dignity, and with an immortal soul? Malik thought of humans in the context of Chalcedonian Christology. He viewed human persons as bearers of truth empowered through the act of baptism. Framing the human person in this manner was a feat of monumental proportions. It allowed, among many other fundamental rights, for the crafting of Article 18 of the Declaration, which guarantees religious freedom, In American parlance, the Europeans call it freedom of religion or belief. And it included something revolutionary at the time, which was not only the right to religious freedom, the right to assemble, but also the right to change your mind and change your religion. If a human being is a bearer of truth, he must be able to search for the truth and find it. And that includes the right to change one's mind. For those of you who may come from a Roman Catholic background, you might recognize that this is the kind of phrasing that was employed also later on by John Courtney Maury when the drafting of Dignitatis Humanae took place in 1967. But Malik thought the American conception of man was too individualistic, and he viewed the communist materialistic version as a great threat to human dignity. So you have the Americans talking about individualism, and then you have the communists viewing man from a material ethos. Malik saw man as uniquely valuable in himself, but as constituted in part by and through his relationship with others, his family, his community, his nation, his God. Therefore, Malik thought it was critical that civil society, organizations such as religious associations and the family, stand between the individual and the states. To pursue his vision, he made an alliance, among other, with two Latin American delegates, one from Chile and another one from Cuba. Exactly. The man from Chile was called Hernan Santa Cruz, and the delegate from Cuba was called Guy Perez Cisneros. These engaged in a struggle of idea with all the other delegates. As John Humphreys, the Canadian delegate and rapporteur of the crafting of the Declaration, characterized in his diary, the two special interests that have tried hardest to influence the Declaration are the Catholic Church and the Communist Party, the former with considerably more success than the latter. So let me introduce you to Guy Perez Cisneros. Perez Cisneros was born in Paris. His father was a Cuban diplomat who had married a French woman. His family returned to Cuba during a tiny sliver of time where Cuba experienced political hope and renewal of its identity. You see, in 1940, Cuba had adopted a new declaration. And in 1944, just 4 years later, they had voted out of office a corrupt president, Fulgencio Batista. Sadly, this period of freedom would be short-lived since Batista would return in 1952 and overthrow the government. And in 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew Batista. But in 1945, when Guy was a delegate in Paris for the drafting of the Declaration, there was enormous interest in freedom in Cuba. Cuba was experiencing a period of vibrant democracy, and Perez Cisneros, who was a devout Catholic, found himself at the forefront of a political movement that was fueled by Catholic social teaching. So Perez Cisneros collaborated with the other devout Catholic, Hernan Santa Cruz, in drafting several aspects of the Declaration. By the way, some modern lawyers that write about the Declaration talk about Hernan Santa Cruz solely as a socialist, as if being a socialist and a Catholic at that time was impossible. They have tried to strip Hernan Santa Cruz's faith and religious belief from history. Both of them drew much of their inspiration from an encyclical called Rerum Novarum, which in 1891 had given birth to what many consider a new social order, in which the Catholic Church, as Santa Cruz argued, had raised its voice against injustice and human exploitation. As a result, Perez Cisneros insisted that it was essential to indicate in the Declaration that the possession of each right implied a corresponding duty. As it was, he felt that the Declaration placed too much emphasis on individualism. It is for this reason, for instance, that he insisted in including "and family" in Article 23 of the Declaration, which reads in the exact same manner that it was drafted in 1948. Everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. A lot of modern historians attribute all the social and economic rights listed in the original 1948 Declaration to contributions from the Soviet Union. In fact, it was the Chilean and the Cuban delegates who made these contributions to the Declaration. It may be that one of the reasons they're obscured is because shortly after the Declaration was crafted, there was a push here in the United States, understandably, against communism, and some of these ideas were viewed with great suspicion, and they were buried in the annals of history. Worthy as this contribution was, Pérez Cisneros must have been quite insistent. At least it seems that way by the manner in which he's depicted in John Humphrey's diaries. For any of you who's interested in the history of the Declaration, I would strongly recommend at least two books. One of them is Mary Ann Glendon's terrific book, A World Made New, in which she talks about the Declaration. It reads like a movie. It's fantastically and beautifully written. The other one is a little bit more gossipy. It's like the People magazine of the time. So it turns out that John Humphreys was tasked with keeping records, and he kept very explicit records, and then he sanitized them and published them as a diary. But after he died, someone compiled his real diaries, and those are also published. Those are harder to get, but very juicy. So in his real diary, this is what he writes about Pérez Cisneros. If the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not adopted at this session of the General Assembly, it will be in great degree to the fault of the Cuban representative, Mr. Guy Cisneros. He's a man of intelligence who possesses neither judgment nor vision. He has wasted more time and caused more difficulties than any other member of the committee. For this, he should burn in hell. So, yeah. John Humphreys wasn't a big fan. After the Declaration, Pérez Cisneros returned to Cuba to fuel a revival of Catholic social teaching and create the Christian Democratic Party. Sadly, he died suddenly at the age of 38 of a brain aneurysm. A bust commemorating his contributions to the Declaration was destroyed when Castro turned the main square of Havana into Revolution Square. This foundational normative approach of Bartolomé de las Casas, talking of others as brothers and sisters, combined with the contributions of Charles Malek, Guy Pérez Cisneros, and Hernan Santa Cruz to the modern idea of human rights, illustrates the profound and enduring role of Christianity in shaping modern framework of human rights. Las Casas laid a theological and philosophical foundation by calling the indigenous people our brothers and reminding the church that Christ had also died for them. Centuries later, this same ethos resonated in the lives of Latin American delegates Guy Pérez Cisneros and Hernan Santa Cruz. They added their voices, advocating for universal rights through visions deeply influenced by their shared understanding of Catholic social teaching. Finally, it was Charles Malek who infused the Declaration with a Christian understanding of human dignity. Together, these figures wove a tapestry of perspective unified by the belief in the sacredness of human life and the moral obligation to protect it. Their work demonstrates that the modern human rights framework, while often presented as secular, owes much to centuries of Christian thought, a legacy that challenges to recognize the divine imprint in every human being and the enduring importance of this foundation. For me, this legacy is not merely theoretical or historical. It is profoundly personal. On my desk, I keep a photo of my father taken in 1957. He is aboard the Queen Mary. He's about to go to Europe, and his face shows the expression of someone about to go on a great adventure. He is a lawyer. He's a rich man. He's a businessman. All is well. And he does not know yet. He doesn't know that in 4 years he will lose everything. His home, his homeland, members of his family. He doesn't know that he will be destitute, exiled, and poor. He doesn't know he will go to Miami and his plan to learn English watching I Love Lucy will not work. No surprise there. He doesn't know that he will go to Puerto Rico and the Cartier watch he was wearing in that photograph he'll sell to buy food for his wife and 3 young children. Doesn't know that he'll have to sell vacuum cleaners from house to house. He doesn't know that his friend Eddie will spend 17 years in prison in Cuba, enduring unimaginable torture for refusing to go along with the Fidel Castro regime. Yet, even amid such unimaginable trials, my father, a son of Cuba, a son of Bartolomé de las Casas, a son of God, will never doubt for a moment that he was born with human dignity, that no state can give it to him, and that no state, as a consequence, can take it away. For my father, as for me, this conviction is rooted in Christ. It is Christ who reveals the source of human dignity and the foundation of our rights. The incarnation of Christ declares that God so loved humanity that he entered our world to redeem it. This was the bedrock of his life that gave him strength in exile, perseverance in poverty, and hope in the face of loss. This was what gave him strength to rebuild and provide a life for us. When I look at that photo, I see a legacy of faith. A faith that sustained my father, that shaped my career, and that continues to illuminate the path forward. I thank you at Trinity for carrying this legacy forward. Standing firm in the knowledge that dignity is eternal, that we're only here for a short time, but that everything we should do, remembering that we're born with a human dignity, and so is everyone else. Thank you very much.
All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and begin a Q&A.
Let's see. I think I'm on now. There we go. Kristina, that was amazing. And so I'm going to start us off with a couple of questions, and then we are going to take questions from the audience. So if you think of anything that you want to ask, go ahead and be thinking about that now. But you've had an incredibly remarkable career. You've traveled the world. I mean, I've heard of a few places you've been, which I think might be everywhere. How many countries have you been to?
I think 45, 50.
45. That's pretty impressive. What country have you not been to that you want to go to? These are not part of the official questions. I'm just interested.
Cuba.
Not yet, though.
Not yet. I was involved in the defection of Fidel Castro's daughter. And the FBI counseled me that I could get into Cuba, but maybe I couldn't get out. But I'm hoping every year Cubans have a toast, next year in Havana, because we're always hopeful. And hopefully it will be a free Cuba.
It would be amazing.
Yeah.
So in all of this remarkable career and in your observation, you've seen different cultures, you've seen different governments, you've been all over the world. There is a fairly marked difference between those cultures that think there is an inherent dignity, an inherent human rights, natural rights, and that the government's job is to protect, to secure those, versus those cultures or governments that think the government grants those rights and can take them away. What are kind of your personal observations, things you've encountered about those differences and what it's like to be in those two different cultures or those two different countries?
Well, thank you. So, isn't she amazing? You're so lucky to have her here. Yes,
I didn't ask her to say that.
I know.
Totally free.
It was. You can pay me later. But so we all know the classical examples of places where the rights come from the state, therefore the state can take them away. Places like China and Russia. But a place that's becoming like that is Europe or the European Union, where not only are the laws changing, but the culture is changing. And there is this prevailing mentality that anything that goes wrong should be fixed by the government, and that anything that you'd like to do, you require the government permission. And one of the reasons I talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being so important, because it has become part of the cultural ethos, is that laws are important, but culture and law shape each other. And when you have a culture that leans in a certain direction, it pulls the law. The same way that the law can pull culture, but the culture has a very strong pull. And in the European Union, and I'm sure you've heard all the stories, for instance, a woman arrested for praying in her head in front of an abortion clinic in the United Kingdom. There is this great aversion to offend in Europe that is very difficult to understand and to navigate, and that is affecting freedom of speech, freedom of religion. There's also a tremendous push towards not being offensive to certain groups. So, for instance, in many places in Europe, if you say, I want to have at my church a meeting of single Christian women, you could very well be taken in for hate speech into the local court because you were not inclusive, and you have a pretty good chance of the judge siding with the person who brings you to court for not being inclusive. And that is detrimental to foundational human rights, and it comes from the idea in the law and in society in Europe that the state grants you all these rights, and therefore the state can take them away. And I consider that to be an enormous danger for our freedom and in general, and for religious freedom in particular.
Do you feel that there's any sort of pushback with that in Europe now? Or are you seeing this just being sort of an accepted mode of the way things will be?
Are we still being taped? Okay.
Never mind.
I'll say
Withdraw that question.
I'll say it. So I'm on Meta's oversight board, as was mentioned earlier. The oversight board was created with a $130 million trust by Mark Zuckerberg because he understood that Meta needed assistance in figuring out some content moderation decisions. So as a result, I have encountered this amoebic world, a world without boundaries, that is extraordinarily powerful, right? Half of the world's adult population uses a Meta product, WhatsApp, Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. And it's in Europe, in order to attempt to regulate content moderation, there's a new law called the Digital Services Act. And the Digital Services Act is attempting to regulate what is said online. And the law is so vague that it's going to be very difficult to navigate how to handle religious freedom issues. My husband's giving me the look like I don't understand. I forgot the question. Okay, in my defense, it's 11:30 p.m. my time. Okay, what was the question?
We're going way off script here.
Yes.
No, the question was, do you think that there is pushback against this in Europe?
Okay.
This kind of
Sorry.
ideology.
I started with my oversight board. No, I do. Yes and no. I think in the general population, there is a great discomfort of raising issues that make other people uncomfortable. But I have seen a resurgence or a revival of Christian groups, for instance, in the United Kingdom, that are looking at our church community needs to do something to be able to speak out. And if we continue hiding in our churches and not talking about these issues, our church congregations are going to be minuscule, and we're going to have to stay in the building that is our church. So yes, there has been a resurgence of Christian groups in the United Kingdom. There has been everywhere I go, in France and in Italy, particularly young people are very interested in understanding the American model of how do you speak about these issues in public without being offensive, but also being persuasive. And I think that gives me great hope. And I'm sorry I had a small detour there.
That's perfect. We like the detour. That was interesting too.
Okay.
Something that you mentioned, John mentioned in his speech. We had a speaker at the CLS National Convention last year, Rebecca McLaughlin. She talked about that there has been this idea that Christianity works against human rights, that it is actually the repressive, religious, kind of bringing people down, not allowing people to live with dignity or to live in liberty or individual or whatever they're going to describe it. And what you've all pointed out is it's actually exactly the opposite. History shows that. It has been Christianity that has always promoted those sort of individual rights, whether it was the right of women to be equal to men in spiritual matters, whether it was the right of slave and free to be equal. That spiritual equality and inherent dignity has always been a part of that. How do you think we, especially looking at like the young students in law school that are here, how do you talk about that? How do you, when you're getting that pushback, when you're hearing this idea that Christianity is repressive, Christianity doesn't encourage human rights? What is the response to that? How do they talk about that? How do they refute that in a gracious way, persuasive way?
Oh, that last part, in a gracious way. Okay, now I have to revise my thinking. No, I'm only kidding. So first of all, I think it's important to understand that Christianity and Christians are not the same thing. So oftentimes when people talk about Christianity did this, no, it was people who used Christianity in order to excuse their bad behavior. So whether they call themselves Christians or not is immaterial. At the core of Christianity is human dignity. I mean, before Judaism and Christianity, the king was curious about how the body worked. He would call a slave forward and have the slave killed. There was no value to the individual human being in front of them because there was a hierarchy where there were people that have value and people that didn't have value. What is revolutionary about Christianity is precisely that everyone is born with the same value and everyone dies with the same value. Imagine how revolutionary that was for people that had slaves and servants and treated others with disdain as if they had no value. So first, remember what Christians are not Christianity. Remember what Christian values are. And also remember that horrible things have been done in the name of many other things. Horrible things have been done in the name of race. Look what happened in Rwanda with the genocides. Horrible things have been done in the name of, communism as well, in the name of ideologies. That doesn't mean in the case of communism, the ideology is intrinsically wrong, but go back to foundational principles and also read that footnote for the students. Every time that you get a book, do your due diligence. We, I think, can be starstruck by the fact that someone wrote a book, but that person comes with their own views as well. Dig and pull and don't be afraid to be the only person in the room that says something. I find that a lot with students, where I get it. Being part of the group is so much cooler and so much more comfortable than not being part of the group. Challenge yourself to be that person in the room who very graciously asks the question or wonders if what's being said is true or not, do the research and come back.
You got an applause for that one.
I got an applause for that one. Yeah, you didn't even pause for it. It could have been more applause, you know. Thank you.
I'm moving it on because Anton is giving me the look.
Oh, okay.
And this is kind of an interesting question because you talked about the Declaration of Rights. You talked about all the different cultures, countries coming together on that. But this idea of universal brotherhood, of spiritual equality, of inherent dignity, is Christ necessary? Or do you think that's just sort of a general, if I have a general theistic approach to life, will I embrace these concepts? Or do you think it's truly Christ, is it Christ-based, Christ-centered approach?
Mm-hmm. We have an unfair advantage, right? We have the truth. And the truth operates independently from us. So do we need Christ in our lives? I would argue yes. And as a group of Christians, I would imagine that you would the same. So for other people to have that view of brotherhood is absolutely possible. I work with all sorts of religious groups that have the same view. I would argue in the end that they all have a little piece of the truth and that we're all going to that same figure in Christ. Some other people call it something different. I mean, the great C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, right? The last book, Reapy Cheap, the little, is that how you pronounce it? Yeah. The little mouse, goes to heaven. So I think we need to be gracious to other people, but ultimately I think they're all approaching Christ.
Do we have some questions from the audience before Anton has a microphone. Have any questions out here? Okay, one right here.
Don't say anything.
We're bringing you a microphone.
Yeah, I was curious. You had mentioned Christian philosophers which provided arguments in favor of the Declaration. I was wondering if Jacques Maritain was one of the ones you were thinking of.
So Jacques Maritain was a great Catholic philosopher. He was not part of the original group of drafters of the Declaration. He was part of a UNESCO group, right, John? He was part of a UNESCO group that was asked about the nature of human rights. So before the Declaration, there were queries sent out to people like Gandhi, for instance, and those people informed the Declaration. But apparently, there's no evidence that the drafters of the Declaration had access to those documents.
Questions? Law students, you guys have any back there? You're used to professors calling you out. I'm nicer. I won't call out anyone. Let's see. I'll ask another one in case people want to think. When you were a commissioner, so you're traveling the world on behalf of, explain exactly what you did. Let's start there.
Okay. I was going to say, well, I have a question for the justice. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom was founded, was created under the International Religious Freedom Act. So the International Religious Freedom Act 25 years ago mandated that the United States create 3 entities. We're the only country in the world that has an ambassador at large for religious freedom. In other words, a person whose only job is to monitor religious freedom around the world and inform Congress on the progress or lack thereof of religious freedom. It also started the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. The Commission also monitors religious freedom around the world and makes recommendations to Congress to the State Department about which countries should be placed under what is called CPC, Country of Particular Concern. What does that mean? A country that is placed under CPC has a reduced possibility of getting economic aid from the United States. Countries hate that. And then the third entity that was created by this legislation was that in every single embassy in the world, there has to be an officer who reports to the State Department on religious freedom in that country. What does that mean? It means that that person has to go out and meet with religious groups. And that means that like small Christian groups that have house churches can go to the embassy and say, hey, this is what's really going on. Before IRFA, the International Religious Freedom Act, the State Department would only report on what the country told them was going on. So this is a
very
way
effective bureaucracy.
Yes, yes. So basically, it's circumventing the bureaucratic, mechanisms that the State Department had been using before then. It's saved many lives around the world. These mechanisms that have been put in place, they're not perfect. So as a commissioner, your job is to be an independent person and go to other countries and then press on the government of that country and on our own State Department to ensure that voices are being lifted and heard when they're being religiously persecuted.
Sounds like a really great way to make friends.
Oh, yes. I think I'm on a couple of blacklists.
You're a bit of a troublemaker anyway.
I am a
bit of a troublemaker. What was the most encouraging thing you saw as you traveled the world and talked to people and, had the moment of watching people who were, whether it was flourishing or persecuted for religious purposes? What was the most encouraging thing you saw?
There were so many. We were talking earlier about students feeling a little self-conscious about being in a classroom. I watched the most spectacularly courageous young people stand up alone to their government and advocate for their faith. I went to Iraq, the Nineveh Plains, where Aramaic is still being used in services and worship. And they have teeny tiny Christian communities that are still serving other people in their communities. I watched as young people were so uplifted by the idea that the United States was paying attention to them, that they, in the most difficult and poorest and most war-torn countries, is these people who have faith-based understanding of the world that are helping others. So when the State Department and our government, and the United States is the most powerful country in the world, doesn't lift the stories of these people even momentarily, it lifts entire communities, and that I thought was a great service that the Commission did.
Questions? We have one here.
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could comment how the Christian view of rights would answer to newfound claims to rights, specifically with transgender, right? The right to be called whatever pronoun you want, the right to be considered, to be generally considered whatever gender you want to be considered. How does the Christian claim, because they both claim the word rights, right? It's your human right to, it's a child's right to. How does the Christian view of rights relate to that?
Yeah, Joshan was telling me earlier that the very foundation, the idea that a person in the LGBTQI community can even make a claim that they have an individual right is rooted in the idea that Christianity brought forward, that individuals have inherent and intrinsic rights. How does a Christian respond? Is that your question? Well, not everything is a right. If everything's a right, then nothing is a right. Does an adult person have, the right to go through a transition process like that? I would argue that they do. Do they have a right to tell my 5-year-old that this is something that they're doing? I would argue that they don't. I think we approach those instances with love and compassion and understanding, but that we're clear on what we ourselves believe and that we deserve the same respect. And we have the right to not only uphold those views, but be able to talk about these openly without being certainly canceled by the government. So there's a great book by Abigail Strayer. What's the name of the book? Irreversible Damage. It navigates these concerns in a much better way than I could.
Other questions? Come on, one right here in the middle.
Taken from that last question and amplifying it to the national scale, how do we, ought we to think about something when we're talking about a universal declaration? Last time mankind got together to do something, we built a tower, it didn't end well. And the intersection with the expression at various cultural or national levels where the idea of universality doesn't actually trickle down because there can be differences in the local expression. So how do we, on the one hand, respect the differences that are inherent in different nations and cultures, and at the same time uphold a kind of a universal principle?
A universal principle of just general rights.
Yeah.
Coffee's kicking in.
Coffee. The coffee was kicking in.
Oh, the coffee was kicking in. So I think what you're asking is about relativism, correct? Or
In part, but not. I don't mean that in a dismissive way. There are different circumstances different cultures are in, and therefore they develop different habits and have a different view on right. That's inherent. I mean, an American expression can legitimately be different than a Cuban expression, which can be different than an Angolan expression, and that's the nature of us being humans, but also in different tribes, nations.
right. So I think Bartolomé de las Casas is a great example, right? He argued that the indigenous people had their own rights. He even defended at one point human sacrifice. It's like, it's their practice. I mean, I disagree with that. I think there are limitations to exercising your religious freedom. But human rights is universal, but it has to be spoken in the dialect of the locals. I lived in Oxford last year, and I found that American English and British English are two entirely different languages, and I think it's a function of listening and understanding fundamental rights that people have. We cannot be too black and white about this, right? And I think that the beauty of the history of the Declaration is precisely that, even though, I just argued that the whole idea of the framework of the Declaration was imbued with a Christian understanding in the world. There were also contributions made by the Hindus and the Muslims and the Jews that participated in this process, and we can all talk about it and live together. So,
do you think Americans have a particularly difficult time with this? Do you think that we, you talked about, there's always this American concept of individualism that is not common in the rest of the world. Honestly, it is kind of distinctly American, and I think comes with that, Americans tend to think that we have all the answers, that we are the best at everything. How does that, and sometimes we are, but how does that translate when you are trying to talk to other countries, when you're trying to work with other places? How do you sort of rein that idea in to be able to listen, to be able to understand that cultural exchange, the cultural differences?
I think you're a great example of that. I think you're an excellent listener. I watch you work with your fellows, and you're an observer, and you're very good at positioning yourself in a way that the other person can understand. Are we Americans, when we go to other countries, do we trip on ourselves? Yeah, sometimes we do. But my experience in the diplomatic world and here in this country, the vast majority of Americans just want to embrace other people. I mean, in what country a woman of refugee parents and immigrants with an accent can be 100% American and 100% Cuban? In other places, you live in the hyphen between those two. In places like France and the United Kingdom, you're never really truly English or truly French. You're a foreigner who has been living there for 500 years. I think that the great fabric and the tapestry of America, I don't like to call it the melting pot because I think we retain our individual personalities in all of this, but I'm very proud to be an American and to go to other countries. I think we're the number one country to give the most foreign aid. No matter where you go around the world, there's a disaster, and American faith-based organizations and the American government is giving billions and billions of dollars in assistance. So could we be a little bit more humble? Maybe, sometimes. But I think it's okay to talk about American values to other people, the value of freedom, the value of intrinsic dignity. Those are not bad things.
All right. I think one more question, if there is one. If not,
maybe I can ask a question since I'm here.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Let me think. What is it going to be?
It'll be quick. Don't worry. Well, it could be quick. It could be long. There's a lot of good research coming out of particularly Wake Forest that talks about the virtue of hope for Christians. And a lot of people in the human rights terrain have at times lost hope in the changing regimes in certain countries. How do you navigate between the balance of hope and hopelessness in your line of work?
It's a good question for a Cuban.
Yeah. No, it's... I'm never hopeless. Navigating the UN bureaucracy could possibly kill the most optimistic of people. But ultimately, the majority of the people that work in this field truly want to achieve something. I mean, so all of these people want to end poverty, for instance. And then some people think it should be the government's responsibility only. And we Americans think that it should be faith-based organizations and volunteers and some of us, not necessarily depend fully on the government. And some people think that there should be a distribution of wealth. But ultimately, we have a moral consensus. We all want to do some things and to achieve that. So I think there are a lot of great people in these systems. I think we in academia tend to forget sometimes that it's not all academia and it's not all international systems. And again, to mention Bartolomé de las Casas, we have to be a little bit more interdisciplinary about our approach to these issues and figure out a way to navigate it in ways that improve the world. And sorry, it's midnight for me, so at the end,
That's a good answer.
I sounded a little bit like Miss Universe at that point, like
World peace.
World peace. But thank you so much for putting up with
On
this.
that
And my
note,
pleasure.
thank you all for being here.
Round of applause for Kristina and Jamie. Thank you all. And as part of the last installment for tonight's attractions, I would like to give the floor for closing remarks to Dean Eric Halvorson. And once again, thank Trinity Law School for being such a gracious sponsor and allowing us to have this event here in beautiful Huntington Beach.
Well, the hour is late, particularly for those on East Coast time, so I'm going to shorten my closing remarks. I certainly want to take this opportunity to thank Christian Legal Society for the partnership we have with them in the Witte Lecture Series. As was mentioned earlier, this is the second year. Last year, it kicked off on the East Coast. It's on the West Coast this year, and we'll be alternating every other year. So keep your calendars open for 2 years in late January. Obviously, special thanks to Kristina for her lecture tonight, for Justice Grosshans for her role, for Professor Witte, what he had to say to us this evening. Students and alumni, representatives from other law schools, Christian Legal Society chapter leaders, we're so delighted that you've been with us this evening. I want to give a special thanks to those people who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes to put this event on. A couple of folks, Christy Martin and Katie Dana, thank you for your assistance. And my executive assistant, Krista Scala, who's, she's here probably hiding in the back, but just done tireless work in putting this together. I just want to say a couple words about our law school. By God's grace, we are entering our 45th year as a law school in Southern California. The mission has not changed. We exist to serve Christ and the community by championing a biblical view of law and government. We're committed, without apology and without compromise, to upholding biblical and historic Christianity, to integrating law and theology throughout our curriculum, throughout our co-curricular activities, and our overall strategy. We're committed to teaching the law from a classical natural law theory of jurisprudence. We want to equip our students to evaluate law and public policy from a Christian perspective and to leaven our culture in the public square. We are producing scholarly work that embodies a biblical perspective on law and public policy, desperately needed in the academy today. And we're also preparing students to be practice ready. When they graduate, we want them to be ready, and the best way they can be ready is through participation in our clinic offerings and our courses on practice management. This is a big task. Prepare students for a life of service to their clients, but also to their community, because lawyers get on school boards. Lawyers get involved in their communities. They go much further beyond their law practices. So we prepare students. We want to speak to the academy through scholarship, and we want to speak to the public square through events like these this evening. It's a task that's worth our effort. We maintain that at few times in our nation's history has there been such an acute need for upright lawyers, and thus for law schools that are committed to the formation of students in virtue and the historic Christian tradition. The influence of well-trained lawyers, but equally important, the influence of virtuous, well-trained lawyers is profound. Whether the graduates are called to private practice, whether they are called to the legislature, whether they are called to the judiciary. And where does this come from? It's all about faculty. Faculty, I say it over and over again, it's the secret sauce to a successful educational institution. Nearly all of our full-time faculty and many of our adjunct faculty are present tonight. I'd ask them to just stand for just a brief moment so we can acknowledge the effort that they're putting in and day out. Full-time faculty and adjuncts. I submit to you that rarely will you see professors so united in fulfilling the mission of their school, and I thank God every day for these people. Yes, we're very mission-driven, but we are visionaries. Our vision is ambitious going forward. It includes expansion of our facility. It includes acquisition of a new facility over time, addition of more faculty, and pursuit of ABA accreditation, which, whether you like it or not, is the gold standard for accreditation. It's within reach, and we're claiming it. All of these things are critical to our flourishing as a law school. We seek to be the best. And why? Because this is kingdom work. And why not the best for the kingdom? I mentioned earlier the importance of clinics to help prepare our students to be practice ready. We offer a lot of clinical opportunities, mediation, religious freedom. We have a mobile law office that visits the homeless community in Orange County to minister to the homeless. And we also have our clinic that serves the residents of the Village of Hope at the Orange County Rescue Mission. And I think this is a very fitting way to end tonight, because we talk about the dignity of every human being. And what our students are doing under the direction of their faculty supervisors is going to these folks who are at the bottom of society, helping them with their legal issues, uplifting them, and restoring them to effective citizens. Other law schools would love to have this clinic at the Orange County Rescue Mission. And in fact, a very prominent dean of one law school in this area came to the director of the rescue mission and said, we can provide a whole lot more support and funds if you would switch to us. And the director said, thank you very much, but we're going to stick with Trinity and their students, because this school is a wonderful example of an educational institution that is not just handing out degrees, but it's calling their students to provide a helping hand to the least, the last, and the lost. So as a reminder to you in closing of what our work entails, as you leave, we have a gift for you. And this gift will be in the back as you leave. It's coffee. It's coffee from the Restoration Roasters Coffee and Company, which has been established by the Orange County Rescue Mission. Listen to what they say. Drink Restoration Roasters coffee and give a drop of hope, a cup of compassion, and a life transformed by the Orange County Rescue Mission. We come alongside homeless men, women, children, and veterans with a handout to the homeless. Compassionate and comprehensive services. That's what our students are doing. They're providing services to these people. So please take this as our gift to you when you leave. Please, one per couple. We don't have unlimited supply. And it's our way of thanking you for attending tonight. Let me close with a short benediction. Now may our Lord Jesus Christ himself and God our Father, who loved us and gave us eternal comfort and good hope through grace, comfort your hearts and establish them in every good work and word. Amen. Thank you very much. Good evening.